Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending where in the world you are. And thanks again for joining the TK show. It's the second of the year. It's the second show of the year. And in keeping in theme with the show where yes, we do cover politics, we cover economics, and we cover development. But what we're trying to really get to is to say, putting in the architects and the little building blocks that really ensure that we can actually get to that stage. And today's guest, Dr. Koffi Kouakou, but he'll clear that up for me, is, well, I would say he's a veteran in the field of, I'd say once upon a time scenario planning, but now, like the field itself, he's moved towards anticipatory governance. But I think he'll explain that a bit better as we go through the show. Bonjour.
Ouais, bonjour, 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 Ticket, comment allez-vous?
Comment ça va?
Ça va très bien.
Ah, thank you. And that's as far as
OK.
my French lessons went, and then I just dropped out in class. At least I always remember the standard greeting. But yeah, Koffi, just again, thank you so much for joining the show. I've been a long time admirer. I have to just tell people of when I started to get into scenario planning and thinking, you were always one of those guys who was at the foremost of the subject. And we're going to touch on that, but just, a bit of a biography, because looking at you, I think you've done the full gambit of focusing on West Africa. Obviously, the advantage of being a bilingual French and English means you cover the continent in quite a unique way. Also, know you've been involved in some of the World Bank, some United Nation programs. But just a quick bio on you, because you're quite large in the things that you tend to cover.
Yes, indeed. First, let me rectify something. In fact, I am not a doctor yet. I know
Yeah.
it does happen. I've started and then I dropped out. It was, in fact, but I've been very, very fortunate in life to have a wide range of experience. And one of the things that I did, in fact, on the advice of some people I've known, they've said to me, because the whole traditional advice was, hey, look, focus, 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 stay on your lane, be very specialized in one area. And I've noticed that that was a kiss of death.
Mhm.
And I decided to branch out in specific things that will help me to survive. And I always said that, speaking either French or English is really not because I love it. I've come to love it a little bit later because of the power of language and communication, but I've done so because of survival, literally. So the language has given me an immense opportunity to really move into an area, at least in life, where I could speak both English and French and then a little bit of Spanish and what I call languages of power. And they open up doors that are incredible, right? And that's quite helped me. I'm originally from Côte d'Ivoire. Yes, I was born in Abidjan, so it was a very small city. Yes, you remember AFCON took place this year there in Côte d'Ivoire, and strangely enough, Côte d'Ivoire won, which was sort of yes. I mean, many of us were not quite sure they would win, but this was a miracle, incredible plays, and they finally won. So a bit of pride there. And I started very early on when I was about 3 years old to go to school in Abidjan. And these were in the really early 60s. So you can guess my age already. In any case, I was lucky enough to learn much earlier. And my father, who was a former police officer, he's late today, exposed me to reading. And we had a little library, private library at home. And one thing he used to have was really important. Every time he left for work, he'll put 100 franc CFA on the table and said, okay, here's a subject. If you find the answer to this question, you get the money. It was a very powerful
Nice.
incentive, although capitalistic and materialistic. So it helped me to get ready. But most important, it helped me to anticipate, right?
Mm.
To think about things ahead so that by the time he put the money, I've read all kinds of things and I'm ready to a certain degree, but not fully. And I could anticipate some of his questions. And that got me interested in learning these kind of things. Then I was lucky enough to go to university after high school. And people knew I wouldn't stay in the country anyway. So I was lucky to get some kind of scholarship at the university, exchange scholarships called International Student Exchange Program. That took me to it was Georgetown University that was having that, but they didn't send me at Georgetown. They sent me somewhere in Indiana at the place called Ball State University. But short end of it is that's where I really learned English. So I had a very fabulous teacher, Dr. Riddle. I'm telling you this story because I think it's quite gives you a feel for where I come from.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed learning from her. And from there, I did two master's degrees, one in communication, information communications, with a focus strangely on telecommunication, but also on the critical nature of information by itself. Or what is the role of information in the development of somebody or the country or a nation? Very powerful stuff. I got into information warfare, strategic communication, and so forth. In any case, I finished there and then I did another master's degree in natural resources of all places. Can you believe that? Leaving Africa to go to the United States to do.
The natural resources.
Exactly. We have more resources in Africa than in the US. So in short, that's what it is. But what it helped me to understand is one thing I've now been coining, it's called the periodic table of element economy, right? And Africa is really that place, that economy. We talk about uranium, lithium, anything, you've got that. So it's really by coincidence, I saw that my two degrees have helped me to understand most of these things. And so I also got involved into scenarios way back in Ivory Coast with the former Minister of Agriculture. But most important, I liked and I love to think about not just tomorrow, but how today can influence tomorrow. And this is basically what it is. And I do a lot of things at WITS with Tairisha, with Professor Geshi Karuri, but also with I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for Africa Studies at UJ. I also used to teach at the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism. So sort of broadening a lot of these things, yes. So that's in short the head of the pyramid, or at least the iceberg. We can get into some details later.
No. Thanks for that comprehensive cover, Koffi. No, and look, I like the fact that the issue of where anticipation starts, the prodding of your father, capitalism or not. I think it incentives are what sometimes drive human beings. But just
Mhm.
two quick ones of what you've just said. One, which I find very interesting, the idea that everybody knew you were going to leave, and the question of and look, I always say this, South Africans are a bit like Americans. The passport is a secondary thought, which has its positives, but at the same time, uh, yeah, just expand on that people always knew you were going to leave. Was that
Yes.
quite common that the best and brightest from Côte d'Ivoire would leave, or has it changed that you're finding, or it's still the case?
It's still the case. Many people, but I must say, in the old days, I was very curious, and my exposure to my reading it sort of, pushed me to find out a little bit more. And so that drove me to get out of the country to a large degree. But most people who were doing well had really good jobs in Cote d'Ivoire. Many of them wouldn't want to leave. In fact, the place they wanted to go was to go to France.
Mm.
On va à Paris. And that was the word. On va à Paris. And in fact, some of my friends used to say to me, wait a minute, Koffi, why you have to go to the US when the shortcut is just you don't have to learn a new language. Go to
Mm.
France. And I said to them, in fact, the shortcut for me was going somewhere else. And I chose to go to the US. And it turns out really good because from there, after my studies, I was lucky to work for the World Bank for many years. In fact, that's what took me to South Africa. The World Bank took me to South Africa. And I learned so much that, I can tell you this has been an extraordinary, one of the best experiences I ever had in my life. And so going, it's very useful because you discover so many things. You learn so quickly that you won't even be able to learn that in classes. And it builds the competencies of you being somewhere where you know almost nobody, but you learn to build a network, social capital, very smart people around you, guiding you, you find advice and so forth. In fact, while I was there, I decided to study Japanese, right?
Jeez.
Yeah. So Nihongo Skoshi Hanashimasu. So just a little bit. So in branching out, these are the kind of things that really are very helpful. And in fact, at UJ now, I've been taking a bit of Mandarin to just broaden my horizon about how the world is all about. And that has helped me to maintain my intellectual curiosity, but also build some of my skills, understanding geography, sciences, development issues. And one of the things I learned at the World Bank was really powerful is development economics, but it's now been flipped over. China has just flipped that over. It's a little bit more different. The Chinese are applying it. It's visible today. And China is changing the nature of economics today. There's not enough debate, at least visible debate about it, but the Chinese are.
No, no, that's great. Wow, wow. Just yeah, I think what's a term we don't use often now, global citizen. It's post-Brexit and other things, people have become more insular looking. So it's actually interesting. And then the second point, which I did pick up, I didn't know agriculture. And when you look at agriculture and anticipation and scenarios, I think there's probably more, speaking to farmers, having done some farming, it's one of the areas where you probably do need to always think about the next day but the next day starts with planting today. Just how did you find that agriculture? It's such a yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's you very sharp. You picked it up. I didn't want to go over it, but my advisor at at university was the former Minister of Agriculture. He became Minister of Agriculture at the age of 32 in the 60s. I mean, it was unbelievable. He was originally from Burkina Faso, and agriculture really is a very powerful area of human life. I mean, remember, food. I mean, food is just a small part of it. There's a lot more. But if you can get a sense of what to come and how to prepare to feed people, to get them to organize their lives. Remember, in the old days, people were nomads. They used to move around. But when they became sedentary, one of the key things they started to do, you know, is to really domesticate agriculture. Make sure that they don't have to run around to be nomadic for foods in far places, dangerous places. So if you have food closer to you, or at least a food system around you, it's unbelievable. And you just reminded me, last month I was supposed to go to Zambia for something very interesting in the Southern Africa development region, SADC region, is what's now called food futures, food system futures. So people are looking at the future of food and the systems, the sort of value chain of food systems and their futures in the region. And food by itself is such a powerful area, just the production, distribution, organization around it. The whole system needs to be thought through, not just for today, but also in the long term, sometimes 25, 50 years and so forth. So any nation that can feed itself can be healthy, can have a better future. Any nation that cannot feed itself is in trouble. The risks of really surviving the long term is very, very difficult. That's one of the reasons some of the most powerful nations like the US, Canada, or European countries, or even China are very big producers of food and very powerful agent in agriculture. And so food system futures is a big area today. And I think Southern Africa is working on it. I'm also going to be involved in it very soon again.
No, no, that's actually quite interesting. One of the co-founders of the channel as a whole, Brett, he's also into, I think it's food, but he's looking at it for, I think, alternative meat production perspective. So, and it's one of those things where I remember living in Australia. As you know, there's huge chunks of land in northern Australia, and there was some debate at the time about the Chinese were just buying up huge tracts of land in Australia, which was causing its own issue. But this was about 10, 15 years ago. And the issue of having food security, didn't understand it at the time because, coming from South Africa, you always just this, we know that there is hunger, but I always say it's an issue where it's rather poor governance than anything else. But just understanding how big nations, like you say, prioritize the idea of having food and food security at such a scale that and even on the continent now, it's a thing where certain nations are starting to buy up huge tracts of land in East Africa because of fertility of the land, just to basically ensure the food security. So it's crazy, but yeah, a bit worrying
Yeah,
that it's
yeah. No,
interesting
it is.
where we are.
Yes, because we haven't focused on it, but I can tell you, um, other nations are buying up, as you said, a large swath of land in Africa. The Chinese, for example, have made Madagascar a place for them. So they're buying lands. And also Bill Gates, as you already know, is a big farmer, well, quote unquote farmer in the United States because he's bought huge land. But he's also part of a group of people looking at food systems in Africa. And he funds that at a very huge amount of money and resources because they know Africa is still a very, very fertile. It's the biggest land, one of the land masses in the world, 30 something, a little bit more million square kilometers. And we don't even have many people in Africa, 1.4 billion for that large. And it is estimated that in the next, by 2050 or so, will probably be 2.4 billion Africans. There's so much land. There's a lot of places that are fertile. You take the DRC, for example. I mean, it's just an unbelievable space for agriculture. Uganda is very fertile. Even Rwanda, Burundi, all these areas, even South Africa, South Africa has always been big on agriculture. In fact, the past weeks, sort of report that Stats SA came out with, although the country's economic growth was very paltry, 0.1, one of the two sectors that really grew fast, the first one was agriculture, right? This is very, very powerful, it's significant. And then the other one was tourism. But agriculture remains a very powerful basis for just basic human life. I mean, we hear that 1 out of 5 South Africans go to bed without food.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really, really disturbing because there could be a food system organized like the French do. The French have this system where, by law, all restaurants and institutions that produce food or daily food have to use the leftovers to feed other people. It's unbelievable how that works. And I could probably estimate, I mean, I'm taking a guess that there may be a couple of millions of restaurants and food producing places in South Africa that are wasting food every day.
Yeah.
So it's almost unacceptable to see that people will go to bed without food when there's tons of it because it's been destroyed. Yeah.
No, I think it's interesting because I can't seem to remember the name of the report, but I do know South Africans, much like Americans, we do waste a lot of food. And I think when you do go to restaurants and you just see the way they throw food out. But maybe it touches on the issue of where I think going back to how you started the issues of scenarios. And look, you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong. Most courses, university and otherwise, we think of things in a linear type of fashion. And South Africa, I always say maybe SADC, I say West Africa maybe is a bit different, but you'll tell me if I'm wrong, where even in our lives, it's you're born, you do well at school, you go to university, you get a job, obviously you marry a wife, marry a husband, you have children, and then you either go meet the Lord or you go meet the repercussions of your actions type of thing. So just break that a bit for us, and then how does the issue of scenarios and how did you get into it? And because it would seem as though your life was almost shaped to break away from seeing things in a linear fashion. And you've just spoken about agriculture. And I take it that even when you look at economics, that's how you tend to see things. Just walk us through just your journey of scenarios and how you find that we are unable to almost break the policy cycle of linearity.
Yes, I'm so glad. It's also another powerful question. And it goes back to my advisor, former Minister of Agriculture in Côte d'Ivoire, who, in fact, after his agricultural ministry, he started teaching at the university where I was lucky to bump into him. And he ended up going to the FAO, which is a food and agriculture organization of big UN. So it tells you, and then all our classes, everything we were doing was basically thinking about tomorrow's food. Most of the time, and he kept saying, agriculture is such an important field you need to pay attention to. And another area that you also need to add as a methodology to think about tomorrow is scenario planning. In French, it's called étude de perspective. Or yes, or you can just say perspective. Yeah? It's a very big area of methodology in the French system, and they've developed it in a way. Theirs is a little bit cumbersome, so quite different from, not totally different, but it's a bit more rigorous and very high level. Very few people get in because it's very complicated. So he got me initiated in this, and I started to pay attention. And he exposed me also to a very famous economist and thinker, a bit controversial in France, whose name is Jacques Attali, right? And Jacques Attali, in fact, he was a one of the senior advisors to the former French president named François Mitterrand.
Oh.
And yes, in fact, he wrote a book about it. And the introduction to the book is just unbelievable. I'll share that to you, and you'll see how powerful it is. But at the heart of it was to connect agriculture and the method of the future, thinking about the future. And when I also was lucky to finish my studies and then join the World Bank in Washington, D.C. around 91, 92, guess what? That is exactly the exercise. My French boss, incidentally, again, they were working, they just finished a project on the future of Africa, and it was called Crisis and Opportunities, Environment, Environment and Development in Africa. Can you see that? So the idea was to look at the environment, but within the idea of environment and development was agriculture, infrastructure, health systems, right? To think about it for the next 50 years. And so there, I get involved in it very well. In fact, I still keep a poster of the cover of the book, and I use it for strategy and then future studies and then foresight. And that's how I got into it again. And I kept pushing it, and I stayed with it, right? And then when I came to WIT, one of my colleagues thought, Koffi, you've been talking about this future stuff. We need to focus. Can we develop and put together a scenario planning course that you want to run? In fact, two of them, Professor Antoni and another one, I forgot the name now, who also left. And I started running the course. And I can tell you, TK, the course became so popular. There was a time when it was not even on the calendar of the school. And students will go talk to the head of the school and say, wait a minute, we want this class, we want this course here. And it's worked well. But when I left in 2017, it just disappeared a bit. But we're hoping that with Geishi and then rebranding it under the idea of anticipation, is with the idea of anticipation, developing a course, a whole project around it. There's not only scenario planning, but you also have other elements into it, into foresights and other elements that we can use as methodologies, because there's a basket of these tools that we can use to look at foresight issues and then the future. And then that's how I got into it. And I also do, beside teaching, I was also doing private work with Anglo-American, looking at the future of, mining, for example. I also did some work with the World Economic Forum on looking at the future of mining in Africa. I also looked at London, the economic futures of London. So there's many of these things I get involved in, and they're so exciting. And what it does is it confirmed what I was saying to you, that it's big. It's better to have a broader base of skills than just having into a one area tunnel vision. Like you said, okay, I'm going to specialize only in agriculture. But even when you do specialize in agriculture, you realize that agriculture is much water. It's a system. It's a complex system. And water, you're going to get involved in water. You're going to get involved in soil. You're going to get involved in temperature, geology, so all these stuff. And that was so powerful for me to understand what systems thinking was about, right? And this is where scenario planning took me. So, in fact, the idea of planning has been so, it's not discarded, but it's been really attacked many times because people are afraid of talking about planning because they have the feeling that it's a one way. It comes from, okay, we're planning, we know everything, But in fact, it's not just about planning, but it's, as one of the Dutch scenario planners used to say, it said, scenario planning is not about planning, but it's changing minds, right?
Powerful.
Yes, it's very powerful. Changing mind is the fact that as time goes on, you need to reframe the way you're looking at the, change in the world. And it's about your mind itself. It's not just about the methodology. And scenario planning is a means to an end, right? And I think that's the power that I've kept with me. And I think it's still with me. And I always say that the future is personal as well.
Mm,
Yeah, the future must be personal, because if it's not closer to you, you sort of lose the grasp of what it is that you need to discuss, because people have the sense that when we say 10, 15 years, you got to wait for this time horizon to arrive before you can make decisions. No, you're an agent of change. You start making those changes right up front where you are, make it personal as well as also collective. And I think that's some of the lessons I've learned in scenario planning. I'm still learning, but very shortly. And finally, I also honed my skills with some training. One training in California with there's a very famous group called the Global Business Network. And one of their focus was to use scenario planning. They've done great work to really help decision makers start to think about their actions and how their actions today influence tomorrow, right? So I did a training course with them. I also went to Oxford at the Side Business School to do a bit of training. And I can tell you, I found out that what we were doing here at WITS was really advanced. But of course, you can't say it out loud, you see. So we're really doing some really interesting things that people enjoyed. And when we get a chance, I'll show you the portfolios assignment, scenario planning portfolio assignment of my students. Just unbelievable creativity about thinking about tomorrow.
no, that's wonderful. Then there's just so much richness to pick from there. But just maybe I'll go back a bit. Just the people you've mentioned, because I seem to remember Mitterrand. I know he was a very different type of president for France, almost a break from tradition. So at least when you explain who his advisors, it sort of does clean itself. But just maybe the idea of planning, it's would you say, look, obviously when you say planning and centrality, people always think of the Soviet Union, just comes to mind. And that almost creates a polarity to say, no, we don't plan from up high type of thing. Do you think, and obviously, look, the African continent was heavily exposed during the Cold War to that type of thinking. Do you think is that maybe one of the reasons why our governments are reticent to almost allow
Yes,
a bit of free thinking?
yes, you're right. Planning had a bad name because of the Soviet planning. But to a certain degree, planning by itself is not a bad thing, because China has shown that you could do that. You can have a hybrid systems of thinking about today and tomorrow and organizing yourself so much so that you don't have a rigid planning, but you have a very sort of adaptive planning that helps you to deal with your challenges. And lo and behold, China is just breaking the curse about planning one another, where you combine, a specific idea of planning, but action, rapid action, right?
Mm,
So that you don't waste the time. This is what I was calling with a friend of mine called hyper action, which means you're planning, but you're hyper enough. The speed of doing things is very important to get things done quickly, but also think through it, iteration as you go. And you need planners to a certain degree, because if you don't have a sense of planning, you lose, the sense of purpose and focus on what you have to do. You need some serious planning. I mean, every nation has a form of planning. Of course, the Soviet planning system came out to become the sort of if you want, the specter of anything about planning. But China has changed that now. If you look at it very clearly, Chinese have a mixed style of planning, sort of semi-capitalist socialism mixed up. And that kind of pragmatism is what we need. So labeling what we do or who we are, sometimes it doesn't, and we're finding out now. If you look at, for example, the little conglomerate of the BRICS, it's an eclectic group of nations, each of them with strange ideologies. I mean, they don't even match. We don't even know how to call them anymore, but BRICS
mm.
Plus, right?
I think the acronym plus could just mean
Exactly.
anything. Plus plus.
Exactly. So what we're now getting is that you have to be a pragmatic, you got to have a pragmatic approach to today and the future. Use what works for you, understanding the context within which you apply these tools. Scenario planning is only worth it if you can see, the results, the evidence of those kind of planning or the kind of thinking around making tomorrow a better place today. Don't wait for tomorrow, but the idea of organizing yourself in a way that makes you think it's about the mental model. It's about how you think about today and tomorrow. So when you think about tomorrow, you sit down and you say, oh my goodness, what do we need? What are our challenges, of course? How do we fulfill these challenges? And today it's almost unacceptable that I know the language of scarcity and poverty is always been thrust on African countries. African countries are poor. In fact, it's the reverse. African countries are some of the richest ones in the world,
Mm.
right? But they're made poor because many of their leaders, and myself included, I'm not saying I'm a leader, but we haven't done much to really make people understand that this present and the future are things that we need to plan about, need to work on them, so that as we work together on planning and thinking about the resources we need, um, we can get out of this mentality of scarcity. I mean, there's so much in the world. I was reminding a friend of mine the other day. I said, do you know who is the first producer of iridium in the world? He said, no, I don't. I said, do you know who is the second producer of iridium, which is a metal?
Mm.
One of the rarest metal, but also durable, very tough. South Africa is, and it's such an expensive mineral. And then guess who's the second one? Haiti.
80.
Yes. So
Jeez.
it's a mineral that's produced thanks to the arrival of a comet. When the comet hits the Earth, it becomes really different. It's very durable. It's used into very sophisticated military and then aviation and very tough metal areas production. And it's a lot of money to buy. I don't know how much. I think the gram or something costs it's very expensive. I can't remember the cost now. But Haiti is into it. And I said to my friend, I said, do you know why Haiti is in chaos? I said, no. I said, because of this iridium. Guess who's guarding and ring fencing that space where the iridium is?
The big
The
brother of
US,
your.
US military. And he started to laugh. I said, yes, of course. I mean, South Africa is one of the wealthiest one in terms of resource, platinum, iridium. I mean, rare metals everywhere. But we're not getting, the value of that into the country. Somebody else owns it, extracts it, controls the value chain. And this is right across the whole continent. And that's one of the reasons I call that, I say the periodic table of
Mm.
element economy. And this is a very, very important thing for us. And we need to start thinking about it. So to get back to your question again, we want to use that methodology, being scenario planning, foresight, thinking about tomorrow, future studies. I mean, the jargons, there are many of them about foresight and scenario planning. We want to use it as a means to an end. And scenario planning or foresight tools or future labs or future literacy, anything you think about tomorrow are just means. By themselves, they're not the end point. The end point is, what do we use them for? In South Africa and the rest of the continent, we have what I call the horsemen. The horsemen, I mean, the metaphor in the Bible, the horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yeah.
So there are three in the Bible, but for me, there's six of them. The first one, of course, for us is poverty,
Yeah.
or we can even qualify it, extreme poverty, right? And then, unemployment,
Mm.
right? And then, of course, inequalities, all of them are up. And then, of course, the other one, corruption,
Yeah.
right? And then there are other basket of other things that we can talk about, but these are our horsemen. They are the challenges we should face. And what kind of tools can we use? But scenario planning, foresight studies, future studies. But when we talk about the futures only exist because we're in the present. And I think that's the power of the present, to be able to do something about it now, as the Chinese have done. I mean, I'm just fascinated by how a country that's been battered for many, 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 many decades have managed in 40 years to come out and then, take 800, more than 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, TK, this is unbelievable. Never seen in a modern world,
Yeah.
right? But people still don't believe it, right? Because it's so far off, right?
Mm.
And they are building their countries. Of course, we're not saying we'll do the same. There's no way we're going to do the same. But how much can we learn from them? And I'm hoping, by the way, with the anticipatory governance program here at VETS, that we'll organize. I hope people don't steal the idea, but we'll organize a conference, a meeting between Chinese futurists
Oh, that'd be good.
and then African futurists. And what can we learn from both sides? This is going to be an exciting event that I'm hoping to have. How are they thinking about tomorrow? How the Chinese do they have a different way of looking at timelines, time horizons? Yes, probably they do, but how do they act on them? And then how are Africans themselves looking at the future? How do we deal with the notion of time, for example, to make things happen? So these are a few things that I've been thinking about.
No, no, that's it's actually quite interesting. You said there's always that famous say, I think that's storyline, where Deng Xiaoping met the American president and the French president, and they were speaking about each other's histories. And obviously, the French president said, "Look, we went through the revolution. You guys can also get here as well." And then Deng Xiaoping's response was, "You are still young. We will still have yet to see." The idea for them, the future, I guess, owing to colonialism and other things, the understanding of the Chinese, their history is a civilization. And I also see the Indian Prime Minister in his Hindu Vata. That's
Mm.
now India's now main thing, that we're not just a state, we're a civilization. And maybe
Yes.
you're right in saying, if you view yourself as a civilization, and this civilizations look for sustainability and future, yeah, and future growth. I think that's the idea of how civilizations sort of work. So you're right in saying perhaps they can actually teach us something very different. But maybe just to apply a bit of this, and I'll probably put a hypothesis to you. You let me know, from your tool, your different tools of trades that you have. You've given us, I think, a nice bedding in terms of the history of the subject, how you got to it, and also the applicability of it. Because I think that's the other thing people miss, that it's not just where I always find scenarios, futures, foresights different, is it's an applied science more than anything else. My thinking, and this is a hypothesis, would be looking at the continent, that West Africa is going through a rupture of sorts. The young generals, Senegal is going to have its, I think, the youngest elected head of state,
Yes.
who's gone through his own drama. And there's also a point which I think people missed, where President Mbeki was giving his normal yearly lecture at UNISA. I think he said a point which I kind of got thrown under the radar a bit, that he actually gave let's say, the outgoing president a call to say, listen, this cannot fly anymore. So it kind of got thrown under, but he kind of represents, now, I always say I'm agnostic whether you're a Democrat or whichever way you choose to go. But West Africa, for me, represents a rupture of sorts. And the rupture for me would, one of the key things would be the breakaway in thought, maybe not fully in practice, from France. Here, obviously, we're thinking about the young generals in Guinea and other areas who are really coming to the fore. That's one area. I'd probably want you maybe just to say, is there a rupture happening? East Africa is almost one might say, an experiment in democracy, with that little country there in the middle, Rwanda, which is sort of showing what you've said, that stability with the idea of planning for the future. It's almost like a question, because people have always said, by virtue of size and obviously history, Kenya is the leader of the area, and Kenya's talent is quite obvious. But there's always been an issue. It's a bit like India. When does Kenya put itself together?
Mm.
North Africa's rupture has been going on for the last, but I always say North Africa is different in that they still have yet to make, or they seem to have made a decision. Are they African, or are they something else altogether? And obviously, outliers would be places like Morocco and Algeria, which does have a resonance with the continent, very proudly so. but at the same time does play a part on the Arab in what happens in the Arab world. But I think Algeria, unlike most North African countries, is very solid in its
Yes.
Africanness, so to speak. And then obviously Central Africa, you've talked about the DRC, which is almost a question mark of where do we go to from here? And then I would say that then there is SADC, which is stagnant. There seems to be no rupture. Everybody knows what the problem is. And so my
Yes.
hypothesis using all that is where do we go from here? How do we interpret this using a bit of the tools that you've just described to us?
Yes. Excellent point again. I mean, the complexity of it sometimes can just freeze you. So after you've said that, people say, but where do we go with this? So that's exactly the idea about thinking about, futures thinking or foresight or scenario planning. It just, when you look at it, the complexity of the system and the connections and the differences and the eclectic nature of what this system thinking is all about can really freeze you, can stop you from thinking. But we need to also simplify some of these things so that people get a sense of it. And what's happening now in West Africa, I would say, is a form of revolution. People haven't paid attention to it. And if it's not squashed by the Americans or the West or the Anglo-Saxon powers, it's going to be the revolution that we need to free Africa from the yoke of colonialism. And these three countries, especially, are four. The first one, I think, is Mali. The second one, Burkina Faso. The third one, Niger. But the one that we haven't paid attention to, started much, much earlier, is Central African Republic.
Mm.
And the president there, in fact, is an older teacher of math. And he takes a break, yes, once a week. He goes back and he teaches math at the high school and university as part of his calendar, just to get the youth. He just strips down the power mystique and then goes down and then teaches them what math is all about, to focus on what matters for the country. A bit of patriotism, nationalism, but at least focus on what matters. And he's not as young as the other ones, but I have to pick up a point that you made. One of the key area that's really driving all the narrative now, this revolution, is the youth. In Guinea, well, he's not as young, but he's in sort of late 30s. And Mali is also sort of mid and then late 30s. In Burkina Faso, he just turned 35. Niger is sort of late 30s as well. But you can see that there is a sort of a volcano of power now saying, look, we need to take our future into our hands. This whole thing about working in France is not working, period. Mm-hmm. What they call France-Afrique. So that's one part. But in general, what I wanted to say is that there are many futures about Africa, and we need to be aware of that. Even though the African Union has a Vision 2063, I was lucky enough to be part of the earlier conversation about the narrative about AU Vision 2063. So our point was that there will be many futures. The whole African continent won't move onto one narrative. And you put your finger on it very well. From West Africa to East Africa to Central Africa to Southern Africa. So let me take it from West Africa and come down all the way to home. In West Africa, what's now happening is close to a revolution. We've never seen this before, where the people who were weak before, they couldn't find a way to express themselves. Now, through force, the kind of force they could find, they could muster it. So they've sort of projected that force on a group of people we call the military to say, look, guys, we're tired of suffering. We want you to take over. And so the military now has a patriotic conscience, a little bit like, Thomas Sankara in the 80s in Burkina Faso. It's sort of coming back. And people are now seeing this movement spreading nicely right across West Africa, and then making the French colonial oligarchs and then governments really nervous, because France cannot survive without Africa, period. They know that. In fact, there's a Senate report, big report that I have here in French that says exactly that they cannot survive with Africa. Africa is our future. That's what they say in French. In French, they say, l'Afrique est notre futur. All right. So they know it. So losing Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger was a huge kick in the teeth. And of course, the conversation is not just political. Again, anybody who understands what's happening around Africa, at the heart of everything is resources. You know, the resources on the ground, that's the wealth the Europeans have been after. The Americans also after it. And I'm sure you already know that the Hiroshima bombs that killed thousands of people, the uranium that fueled it was taken from the DRC in the Katanga. So Africa's got connections everywhere, although that's a terrible connection. We want something different. The uranium in Niger, you know, of course, the uranium in the DRC is probably the one with the highest density of consistency. Uranium in Niger has been exploited by France for many years, and the Nigerian government was getting a very little one. And people are seeing that why we're not benefiting from our resources. And the question being asked. So there's a movement that's been growing. People haven't paid attention to it. It started a bit long term ago, but it's now getting more and more, steam. It's what's called resource nationalism. And at the heart of resource nationalism is the idea that our resource must serve us first before they serve other people. They not only must serve us first now, today, but also tomorrow. Right? I mean, the kind of discoveries that are now going on, TK, is just unbelievable. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago, I think it was last year or the year before, during the COVID time, that discovered a deposit of gold in Uganda, estimated, listen to it very carefully, I still don't believe it, 13 trillion US dollars. Just go.
Economy.
Yeah, just one country. And it's not being talked about because there's a control on these resources, especially gold. There's a big gold mafia in the world, global mafia, control the price. I mean, if you went and took a look at the price of gold, it doesn't move much at all. It's around 1900, 2000. Now I think it's 2002, 2200 and something somewhere. Somebody's controlling that. They control the value chain of the exploitation of gold, not only gold, but all of the platinum, bauxite. I mean, the list goes on and on. That's one of the reasons I call it the periodic table of element economy. And this is where we are. So at that heart is that what kind of tools should we use to address that kind of economy? But foresight, scenario planning, future studies, right? Because they help us to think through what are we going to do with that today and tomorrow. And I think it's a very good start. And this is what I'm mainly doing with the kind of things, combining my old degree of natural resources as well as futures thinking. And I try as much as I can.
Yeah, that's a nice full circle back to the things you studied, which, because information, I haven't even touched on how information now basically drives the future. We are going into many elections, and we've seen it. I was looking at the Indonesian one, and obviously I can also see in South Africa it's starting to come around. The issue of disinformation. Now you was speaking about, we often use the term propaganda, but I think the way you started the show by saying it's almost a strategic use of information, warfare of sorts. So, and you're right in saying maybe that's where the continent has suffered a lot. It's not so much what you answer to, it's how you see yourself. And I think not enough has really been done. And yeah, look, as we move towards some closure here, just some few popcorn type of questions. First one is the question of our political elite and foresight.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I think I wanted to ask you in that way, especially looking at West Africa, is, and I would say this, look, when you look at the continent, yes, the resources, what's in the ground is important. But I think West Africa and certain other parts on the continent kind of show you that mentally Africans have been on top of their game. But unfortunately, the mass exodus of human capital from the continent enriching. I mean, if you go to your top universities in the States, it's no longer abnormal. There will be a West African scholar of sorts. It's just a
Yes.
given. Obviously, when
Yes.
you go to Britain, it's almost the same. France, we won't even speak about France. Some people say the whole national side is basically made up of those that have left the continent. But then it does bring us to the question, and it's interesting that we go back to Côte d'Ivoire again, because I'm trying to find out if you were under the late president who I always get his name, the one of the very
Ufwe
yeah,
Boigny.
Hussein
Yes.
Bouani, he who built the cathedral. And
Yes.
the question is always, why are we producing such a poor the political elite? Because it's one thing for the revolution to start,
Mm.
but for some reason, and the French have always seemingly got this right. If you look at the Cameroon,
Yes.
Biya is still in charge, not going anywhere, even though we know he's basically mentally not all there. But the question of the political elite on the continent, how is it that we still produce such a poor quality of political elites and their inability to plot the future for us?
Yes. I mean, there are many ways to think about it. And one of the things that in my case I've finally managed to crack is that the part where, the leaders themselves, they're the byproducts of some kind of colonialism. So you just put your finger on it. Even myself, I am a byproduct of colonialism. The education and so forth, the way of thinking. Even grabbing a fork today, sometime when I'm eating with people and they grab the fork or the spoon another one way, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not right. It has happened, but I can't speak it out loud because I have to be politically correct as well. Well, of course, the French don't hold the forks like that. You got to cut it here, you got to do, and that kind of mindset just grounded us into a way. And people are more interested in the resonance of their titles and diploma than on what they can do. I mean, people are studying PhDs and still studying, what, let's say, Zola, Emile Zola, a very famous French, did. I mean, you do a PhD in that. How is this helping Africa? Right?
Yeah, no, it's
Right?
true.
And the Chinese ask this question all the time. Why don't you do a PhD in some practical thing that's helping your country, your nation, your continent? Can we look at this in a different way again? And I think this is a part of decision making about what really matters. What really matters to Africans today, especially the leaders, many of them have a sense of short termism,
Mm.
which means we're going to grab the resources now for us, for our thuggish friends, for a small group around us, the executives, and most important, play the game of those who support them from outside. And in
Mm.
fact, so there's a in sort of domestic issue for that, and personal issues there, and then there's an external issue. The reason why these people are still in power is that they're still supported from outside, largely. Because if they were not, they wouldn't be. I mean, Paul Biya of Cameroon wouldn't be spending half a year in the southern part of France in Cannes or Israel using money from the country because he's supported by these people. Same for Cote d'Ivoire. Same
Mm.
for even Benin. Same for Macky Sall, who just finishes his term now. He's got a few days or so to go, or weeks. But this is a point until that culture is changed. That culture of short-termism and depending on sort of the tutelage of the French or the tutelage of the British or the tutelage of the Americans. It's going to take a long time to understand what really matters for us in the long term. And the Chinese are broken the curse of this short-termism. They're thinking long term. They're thinking patriotically. Thinking patriotically and nationalistic is not a bad thing, period.
Mm.
I mean, if you can't fix your own home, how you can hope to fix somebody else's home somewhere else? That's very simple, right? So these are the two things that really, that's how I managed to crack it, that people from outside as well have used human greed to let people be in those powers. For example, you have a constitution that tells you that you should be there for 2 terms. Yeah, it's a very midterm type of thing. It's not a long term for say. But
Mm.
if you're there for 2 terms and you're not producing, you haven't even made a dent in the lives of people. Why, TK, in the world would you want to change the constitution for a third term or a fourth term? The evidence shows that you can't do it, right?
Mm,
But one of the things that's really challenging now, most of us, is the sense of the long term. So as we're doing the long term, right, the long view, and we look at Chinese leadership, for example, I'm just taking a simple example. My goodness, why would you want somebody to be their president for life, right? But we're still telling people, no, no, think long view. You see the contradiction, and the Chinese are saying, yeah, we have a long view. We have leaders who care about us, who want to take our lives seriously. We want to give them a chance to continue running it. My goodness, this is anathema to the kind of, mental model or democracy or some kind of, I wouldn't even call it civilizational, but civilizational thinking is long term.
mm,
And we still are struggling to have this because our culture and our education rammed into our head is very short term. It's, oh, 3 years, 5 years. And we've now come to a point where we understand, of course, human beings have foibles. That's the concern because when you put somebody there and they get into power, even now with the young man who just became at 44 president of Senegal, right? Five, there's still a little bit of suspicions. This young man, is he going to be there for the next 2 terms as well? Or is he going to try to change the constitution for something else? So until we have that culture, right? But I can tell you that most Africans are willing to give a chance for a long term, probably president for life, to anybody can change their lives. And you can see
mm,
that with
mm,
China. You can start to see part of it in places like Ethiopia. You can see that in part of, well, although Rwanda is a bit of a shaky case for many of us because of the nature of the authoritarian government. But people are saying, if you can change the lives of people for the better, give them a chance to stay. Don't shortcut it. Give them a long view. And we're going to need that long view. Look at what's happening in Russia now with President Putin. You know, the West is concerned because they're changing the nature of their economy, their lives, with just one or two people. And it's difficult to bear in mind that somebody can be there for a long time, for 20 years, but his record is speaking for itself. In
mm.
large part, they've changed the Russian economy in a way that makes most of us feel uncomfortable to a certain degree because of the kind of leadership that stays for a long time. But where does it say that a leader who is making great stride with his nation shouldn't stay for a long time?
No, that's quite the challenging one there. And just to kind of remind me, one of the great exemplars of scenario foresight thinking as a government is Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew, like you said, stayed a long time, but changed a whole generation going forward. And as their
Exactly.
government routinely tweaks
Yes.
the understanding of anticipation and foresight. So you're right in saying it's almost as though you're not speaking of the theory. This is what is happening. And no, Kofi, thank you so much for just covering part of that. And I really do like that idea, and I hope you do really take it forward, the periodic table
Of
development in
elements
economics.
economy. Yes.
Yeah,
And
because
let me
it's
add
right.
something
Yeah.
very quickly to what you're saying with Lee Kuan Yew. His son now, Lee Shun-hen, right? It was now
Mm,
going to retire. He was here in South Africa during the COVID time. He came on vacation in Cape Town. And I'm just wondering if people have even got a chance to sit with him and learn from him and so forth. I
mm,
mean, there was very little in the newspapers. But what they've managed to do under his father and under himself is to create a unit within the prime minister's office. This is a foresight unit and scenario planning unit, and they're doing fabulous job there.
mm. Yeah, and I think that kind of just encapsulates what we've been actually been discussing. That with this applied science, we have to give the long term a shot. And we have to arm ourselves, understanding that, like you said, we have our human foibles, but the understanding of we need to give ourselves a shot. And the key thing I'm also taking away is we probably do need to relook at our education system, which is, yes, it's good to have a specialty. It's good to have accountants and economists. I'm not too sure about economists, but I'll say it's good to have accountants and the like. But the key question is for what end? If it's
Yes.
simply to feed into an old system which is not benefiting our state and the continent, it's obsolete, is the word. And I think you really touched on it. Just any closing words, really, as
Yes.
you drive, as you land the plane for us.
And my closing point is here, it's that question: why think about the future? Why should we care about thinking about the future? And it's a rhetorical question I want to ask, I want to answer it because I mean part of our conversation is about that. But it's a means to establishing a way to think about, critical thinking, not just the short-termism, but stretch our thinking beyond ourselves, although the future is personal, but we need to stretch it. And many personal futures make a long future much, much better, right? And I'm hopeful. I always say that I'm a measured optimist, right? So there's the realities, but we need to learn fast enough. We must change our education for people to start to think critically about the future one way, so that it's not just about themselves only, but it's about other people as well. And on that note, I want to thank you for having me.
Merci, Koffi.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. And
Okay,
that
thanks.
is the TK show with Koffi, who literally has taken us on I'd say, a informed and also a evidence-based call for us to think long term in our policy thinking. And look, I think also in life, the lovely thing about the idea of scenarios and foresight is it's a tool that you can readily use in your own life. As I think Koffi has just kind of shown using his life, that looks, your circumstances, how you think about things, it's not a given. And I love the point that Koffi touched on, which is to say the future is not somewhere 15 years from now. It is now. And it's a today type of decision. And I think perhaps if we started to think about that, I think we'd see better types of policies instead of being told, something magical is going to happen in the future. No, show us now. So with that, I'll bring the TK show to a close. Koffi, I know this is not the last time we're going to be meeting. We're going to probably follow up on a lot of other discussions from this. And yeah, please do stay tuned again. I can basically tell you the next show is again going to be focusing on the continent because something is happening. And we just need to make sure that I think today's discussion with Koffi kind of says we need to have a better and a richer understanding of what this thing means and using the different tools to take it forward. So
Sure.
This is TK closing off, and we'll speak again next time around.
That's right, I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite an important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement, and that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting, and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy, and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate. So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.